All right, everyone. I think we might get started. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Bridget Griffin-Foley in the new Department of MCCALL. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second seminar in our new books seminar series. And I will just move out of that to remind you what you're here for, which is to hear Dr. Wes Robertson in conversation with Dr. Tom Baudinette about Wes's new book, Scripting Japan, Orthography, Variation and the Creation of Meaning in Written Japanese. So I'll now hand over to my colleague, Tom, who is a lecturer in languages at Macquarie, and he will guide us through this in conversation. We'll hear from Wes, and there will be an opportunity for some questions and comments before we will have you all out within the hour by 5 p.m. So Tom, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to introduce a very close friend and colleague, Dr. Wes Robertson. I've had the immense privilege to know Wes for many, many years. We actually studied together in our postgraduate life before we even came to Macquarie, so it's a bit of a dream to continue working. I've seen this project developing and evolving, and always been really excited by everything that Wes has been doing. I just think it's such an innovative and important project. And Wes has a real ability to communicate that project so well. The book is such a fantastic read. I don't have a copy with me. I'd love to be able to kind of show it off. I think Wes has one. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Wes Robertson, lecturer in Japanese here in the Department of MCCALL, to talk, maybe provide us a little bit of background into the scripts of Japan before we then start talking specifically about this fantastic book, Scripting Japan. So Wes, I'll hand over to you and your presentation that you've prepared for us.
Thank you very much, Tom. That's extremely kind of you. I really appreciate that. That was way nicer than you had to be. So just before we begin a dialogue, which is going to be the main meat of this talk today, I figured that maybe the sociolinguistics of the Japanese writing system might be a topic that some background would be good for a lot of people to basically kind of follow along what we're talking about. So written Japanese is peculiar in that it involves three distinct scripts. This sentence here, a very simple sentence, which translates as I drank coffee, watashi wa kohi o nomimashita. You can see all three of them being used together. So this here in red is what we call the Kanji Script, which usually represents nouns from Japanese and Chinese and the non-inflectional stems of adjectives and drinks. So here we have kanji with the word for I and the stem of the verb to drink. This here in blue is hiragana, which is used for grammatical elements and inflection, marking things as the topic and the direct object. And then this tells us that the verb is in what would be called the polite past tense. And then katakana, you can see here, which is used primarily for loanwords from languages outside of Chinese. Here, the word kohi, which clearly is not, comes from coffee. And generally speaking, when you teach Japanese, and indeed when I teach Japanese, we have to tell people that each script has distinct uses. This comes from a well-known textbook called Genki, which gives distinct roles to each of the various scripts. Now, there is some hedging, katakana normally, kanji mostly, but they don't tell you that these, like, what would happen in these other cases. And of course, we have to teach a regular form that people can learn. But the reality, if you go to Japan and start actually looking at how people use script, is that these are not really rules, but more conventions or trends. And there's a lot of variation that occurs all over the place. For instance, you can easily write any sentence in hiragana only, katakana only, completely in kanji, or just in a random admixture. And while these are obviously illustrative, every single script has been used to write the Japanese language. And if you go, you'll see variation all over the place. And this beer bottle has the word biiru, which is normally in katakana, here in kanji. And the word koshi hikari is written in romaji, aromatization, hiragana, and katakana, all on the same bottle. This Starbucks advertisement, uses kanji for kohi. So why does this happen? Broadly speaking, there's been three explanations that kind of happened before I began my research. The first is that there's nothing we can do about it. Basically, as mentioned, all the scripts have been used at some time to write Japanese, and the scripts that are taught in school have changed over time. And things like cell phones have reintroduced some difficult kanji into the public conscious. So to some extent, people argue that you just can't stop it. So some variation is going to happen. The second is that there's legibility related concerns. People say that switching something to a script draws attention to it, like italics are in English. If you have a headline in a newspaper, you don't have much space. So oftentimes they'll use kanji you might not see elsewhere. And there's also been arguments that people have affective connections to the scripts. For instance, hiragana is argued to be seen as a young, cute, or feminine script. Kanji is seen as old or intelligent, and that these can be drawn upon to alter the meaning of a term. This quote here about writing coffee in kanji notes that this sort of old image of kanji, at least for Nakamura, gives the image of a particular cafe, or at least, at the very least, the idea of writing kohi in kanji would make it seem like instant coffee isn't appropriate. And these all exist, but they all kind of come from a static or functionalist view that says if there's a script, then we can tell what's going on. And this is something that has been critiqued in the study of language in general in being a bit of an oversimplification. To give an example in English, if I say that swearing just is evidence of moral deficiency, that would definitely be an oversimplification. Like there's a wide variety of reasons which people use variants like swear words, and just assuming we know what they are from descriptions in the abstract isn't really enough. And so I try to take more of a sociolinguistic view by saying that any linguistic form, basically in use in some kind of context, has what Silverstein calls indexical values, or links to identities, stances, and influenced by ideologies, etc. And we might not be aware of them, but it means that the use of a variant in a context can have different meanings for different people, and across contexts can have different meanings for the same person. So instead of if script then effect, to vastly oversimplify, if script then effect as mediated by concerns of context, ideology, and the other variants in the sentence. This is something which has been recognized outside of Japanese. In the book Orthography as Social Action, Spitzmüller, for instance, talks about the use of the heavy metal umlaut, arguing that ideologies of Germanness are influencing the use of this marker, which doesn't actually affect pronunciation, to connect them with sort of militarism and these other stances they associate with Germanness. And in these books here, we can definitely see ideologies of gender influencing the way that the English is represented. The boys' book in all caps, the kerning is really bad, the letters don't line up, and the font has these little dots in it. In the girls' book, you have the cursive, the little dots over the I. You can definitely see ideologies of gender being influenced in the way that the language is represented, in a way that is just like Japanese scripts lost out loud. And another one that I often list example is if the introductory slide to this presentation was written in Comic Sans, you might have a negative reaction to the potential quality of the presentation, or even me as a researcher. Your understanding of what kind of person swears might be more vivid than what kind of person uses Comic Sans, but at least you might have an idea that a serious academic conversation would not involve the use of this script. So in my book, what I'm trying to do is somewhat twofold. First, given that Japanese has the ability for people to vary the way they represent words anywhere, I can't change the script I use rapidly throughout a text message, but I can change the script I use, an English text message, but I can't do that in Japanese. What can we learn about how meaning is made in Japanese writing through looking at script variation? And then more broadly, what can we learn about this broader question of how the representation of language influences the way we make meaning in any language through analyzing the Japanese context where this can happen and potentially be incredibly important. So yeah, that's kind of the background of what I look at and what Japanese writing is. And then that moves us into my conversation with Tom.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that introduction, Wes. I always remember when I first started learning Japanese myself, just being completely overwhelmed by this incredibly sophisticated, I won't say complicated, sophisticated writing system. And I'm curious to learn a little bit more about what led you to become so interested in script and Japanese script. I learned it as a fact of life. I never sat down and really thought about it actively, at least until I met you and had a number of probing conversations about it. But in your book, you share some really interesting narratives about where you've come from and why you're asking the questions that you're asking. So I thought that it might be appropriate to begin our conversation kind of understanding where you're coming from and what led you to really investigate this kind of phenomenon in so much depth, such amazing depth, I might add.
Thank you very much. I guess initially for a long time, I thought that my first real encounter was this character called Mr. James, who was used by McDonald's Japan as a mascot for these American style burgers with real emphasis on the air quotes. And Mr. James was presented as sort of a dumpy, nerdy guy, and his Japanese was represented entirely in the katakana script. And I was wondering, why is it that this was happening? Why is it that the entire dialogue was represented in the script that's used for loanwords and other things like that? And I was told by Japanese people that it was representing accent or poor Japanese ability. And at the time, I kind of wondered, how is that possible? How is just changing the way a word is represented, a way that, again, like if a computer read it out loud, there'd be no change, able to convey accent to people? And actually, now that I am where I am now, that's kind of a bad question, because comic studies and a lot of other places have shown very conclusively that you don't need specific phonetic detail to connect a representation of language to an accent. But it was a good question, and then it got me to kind of deep dive into this phenomenon. And I started by looking at a lot of context where katakana was used in the speech of non-native speakers and seeing if I could find out the motive for that. It was language ability, was accent, was Japanese ability, the kind of key that shows whether or not katakana was going to be used. But now that I've kind of spent more time on this and thought about it, the first time I actually really realized that there was choice in how you could represent Japanese was at the very, very last year of my Japanese undergraduate major, when I was translating this poetry of a Japanese poet. And he would use really, really obscure kanji representations, including for words that I had been told were only written in hiragana, words that I did not even know had kanji representations. And at the time, it was really just a source of massive frustration because I wasn't able to find any reason for it. There were some words like, okay, this particular representation is associated with this like slight change in meaning. One that sticks out is there's two ways to represent the Japanese word for spicy, and one implies salty. And so I was like, okay, got that. But like writing the word where in kanji, there was no explanation. And I felt just like he was trying to prevent me from reading, like gatekeeping access to the poetry. And so I didn't really have an answer to it. But I guess that was kind of the first time that I noticed that, oh, okay, you can make a choice in how you represent things. And as I learned more Japanese and started living in Japan and seeing more variation, I then began to realize that these choices were things that people were attending to and commenting on, and then in the representation of dialogue could actually have serious social consequences, that people were actually saying, oh no, this person speaks in this script.
I think that idea of speaking in script is really interesting. And it also begins to transition into the next question that I would like to ask, which is, of course, the big question. We know where you're coming from and where that curiosity comes from. But I wonder if you could kind of share with us the major kind of arguments or the major findings that your book has made, and what your kind of intervention, I guess is the best way to put it, is within the study, not just of script, but maybe just even meaning making in a broader communicative sense. Just thinking about this kind of move away from trying to formally describe the use of scripts to thinking about how they're used and played with in social life, I think.
I guess like the simplest way to answer that would just be to say that my primary goal has been, as I've gone through this, to show that it's not enough to look at the representation of language, especially something like script, as something which is just done to language, like something that's just is kind of applied onto it. And rather it needs to be examined as language use itself. The way the use of hiragana, the use of katakana, the use of kanji is not just applied to a word. It is just like the selection of one word over another, an important social act. So it's not just that, say, even if one of the big arguments that I kind of came to at the end of my PhD thesis that I sort of realized was the culmination of looking at all these different ways that people were using script to represent dialogue, was that in a situation where there's this much variation going on, even the choice not to use any variation, to follow every single norm, becomes an important social act. So even if we talk to someone who sits down and says, no, I just wanted to say that this coffee was really old coffee, so I wrote coffee in kanji. Even in that choice, it's contributing to understandings throughout Japan of who uses which script, where they use which script, why they use which script. And so even when we refuse to use any variation, we are nevertheless contributing to the understanding of language and the understanding of how meaning is made, because people have choices and these choices are happening everywhere. And so I guess what really surprised me is realizing even cases where the prior explanations that I gave in the introduction to this speech are the motive, and maybe even the author says they are the motive, those can nevertheless be socially meaningful because people have the ability to interpret them as they wish. There's a discussion I remember from a book by Gottlieb back in the day where she was walking with a Japanese scholar and he saw a bookstore which had written their name in a very obscure kanji. And perhaps they just wanted to say like books, old image. And the scholar said, oh, this place is pretentious. This place is, I don't want to go there. This is like a pretentious shop. And so these kind of understandings might not be intentional, but they're nevertheless circulating in society and probably influence the way that people are going to use Japanese scripts as they go forward.
So would you say then that script use or scripts in Japan or elsewhere even are ideological?
Yeah, absolutely. Once they start moving into these spaces where people see them and make their understandings of them and use them in ways that aren't, necessarily confirmed by their audience, in the same way that if I use a certain language variant or speak in a certain style, it's not confirmed by my, they might not interpret it the way I want to. I might try to be sound academic at the moment, but people who are listening might not accept that. In the same way, I might use script in a way to try to convey something about myself or try to convey a meaning, just like that bookstore. And the people who encounter it, though, might take it into their own way. And so you can see these questions of, our ideologies about who uses language exist in regards to script. And indeed, the other interpretation, ideologies just about language use in general, are something which I noticed in the data influencing the use of script. A key one that I think is hopefully straightforward enough for a non-Japanese speaking audience is that in one text that I analyzed, the first person pronouns that were used by various characters were differentiated by the script that they were written in. And if you were a male speaker, depending on the way you behaved, you'd have your pronouns written in kanji or katakana. So teenagers had katakana as the primary, but if they acted very, very polite, they could suddenly receive kanji representation. Likewise, adult males had kanji representation as the base norm, but if they were kind of punkish, or if they were really angry, or in one case where one was acting very, very silly and kind of being embarrassed that he was posing in his underwear for a modeling picture, they'd have the katakana representation. In contrast, though, all the pronouns used by female characters in the comic were in hiragana. And like the most naughty kind of villainous character in that entire comic was actually a young teenage woman. But despite this, her pronouns were always differentiated from the male speakers. So this reflects a long dialogue in Japan that the speech of men and women are different, or in some cases even should be different. But that's manifesting not only in the use of specific pronouns and use of specific words, but actually in the way those words are represented throughout the text.
And I think that's a really key intervention itself, because whilst I am not a linguist, I am familiar with a lot of this kind of literature. And there's a lot of writing in the Japanese context about, the choice of words you use or the topics of conversation indicating particular stances, as you would have called it. And I think one of the really key interventions of this book, at least in the context of Japanese studies, is to remind us that other elements also kind of are used consciously or unconsciously, it depends on the context, to convey meaning. So I did kind of flag this concept of stance. You mentioned it very briefly in your introduction. You also mentioned very briefly, I think, what is perhaps the key theoretical idea of your work, which is indexicality. And I'm wondering if you might share a little bit more with us what these terms mean, stance and indexicality, and also how your book helps us understand these concepts and makes us understand how meaning is managed and made, just in general.
So, I mean, stance, most broadly, to, I guess, be as simple as possible, is the way that people position themselves in regards to at the simplest, most direct level, a language act, the way people position themselves in relation to an opinion, or the relationship to an assertion, or just the relationship to the various actors that are within an area. And that can influence the way that we use language. To go back to swearing example, when you choose to swear often has a lot to do with the context in which you find yourself in and the way you're trying to position yourself. And the link between when you move between stance and identity, when does a stance become an identity? That's all in my mind kind of a bit of a blur. And so I kind of usually say indexing, stance, and identity, just kind of try to wrap it all up, because when does a position become a act of identity? Arguably always, to some extent. But the indexing of stance and in the indexing of identity then specifically refers to the way in which language is used to point at one of these positions or one of these identities. So the fundamental idea in indexicality is that when we choose one way of saying something over another way, be that through varying the sound of our voice, be it through choosing the word lift over the word elevator, be it through shortening our sentences, lengthening them, using terms that would be considered polite, again, in the abstract, we are positioning ourselves in relation to the conversation, or we are positioning ourselves as aligning with or disaligning with various identities that may be national, they may be global, they may be localized to the small group in which we are talking. But normally, normally is not the right term, but historically in linguistics, the study of this indexing of identity, this indexing of stance, has been almost entirely on speech. And study data that used writing looked at ways of taking what is done in speech and doing it in writing. So taking something like accent and recreating it in writing, say through creative respellings. And there wasn't much look at things that are restricted to the written mode. Research on ways of indexing identity and stance, which are completely lost if we read a text out loud and don't try to recreate something that existed in speech initially, but are inherently based on people observing the way people use language, quote unquote, on the page. And what I think is really interesting about Japanese is because there is this immense amount of variation, which we can see, glimpses of here and there. I mentioned in English and font. In Korean, you can switch between at least two scripts, although they don't do it to the same degree. And there are other contexts where you can switch between scripts somewhat. But Japanese has so much variation in that there's so much chances every single day, every time you send a text message, every time you walk down the street, every time you open up a newspaper, every time you go to look at a tweet, you have a chance of seeing somebody using script in a way that might not be the way you use it. And so consciously or unconsciously, we're faced with the need, or perhaps the desire or the chance, to interpret why that might happen. And that brings us into paying attention again to this kind of variation that is restricted to writing, and the ways in which we navigate meaning and identity, and the indexing of that meaning, the indexing of that identity through writing, that are not impossible, but difficult at least to observe at the same frequency when we move outside of the Japanese context. So while my primary interest in scripting in Japan is explaining Japanese variation, I ultimately hope that by looking at this special context, some of the phenomena that can be seen can help us understand variation that occurs outside of Japanese that is ultimately motivated by very, very similar phenomena, such as the observation of how other people use language on the quote unquote page.
Thanks, Wes. Fantastic response. So I'd like to now turn to the kind of nitty gritty of the book, if you will, because one of the things that I was always very impressed by the project that this book has emerged from is that it was an extremely well-designed project that was very consciously put together to respond to these key questions that you're raising around what does it mean to create variation in script, and then how can I best explore that naturalistically. And I think that that's really kind of been one of the things that I've found most impressive of the book and your work, is this great breadth and depth of analysis that your arguments are based on. So for the benefit of everyone else here in the Zoom room who hasn't had the opportunity yet to read this fantastic book, I was hoping that you might be able to introduce some of your case studies, some of your methods, and talk about why you chose them and how they have helped you kind of really develop this argumentation that you've been expounding to us today.
Yeah, sure. I mentioned very, very briefly that the first study I did was on the representation of non-native Japanese in katakana, or the use of katakana in ways that were formally non-standard within representations of the speech of non-native Japanese speakers. And that started because I'd seen it. So it was a data source that I knew existed, and also because it was really easy to note. When someone uses katakana in a non-standard way, it stands out. And indeed, most of the research on Japanese script variation to date has focused on katakana, I think partially because it's such an obvious, quote unquote, obvious data source. And so I was lucky enough that I started during my master's. So I had a lot of time to see kind of what worked and what didn't and think about how to expand that. And so the master's project came about, and I found out that basically the argument that I did in my master's thesis is that while concerns of languageability were often there, they never were enough to explain the variation on itself. Rather, there were these ideologies of what sort of an ideal non-native speaker identity were. And when non-native speakers performed a different identity, say that they were terrifying or that they were really pretentious, even if their Japanese ability wasn't great, they wouldn't get the katakana marking because they were not enacting sort of that stereotyped non-native speaker identity in Japan. So the next step was kind of then very logically to move into looking at the variation of all of the Japanese scripts. And I stayed with comics because I found that because Japanese media often does use somewhat stereotypical language use or use language variation to convey information about characters, it seemed like a really good place to get some very, very vivid data. And indeed build on the ability to look, okay, look, the author's using these stereotypical pronouns or these stereotypical sentence endings or verb forms that I could kind of correlate and see, like, does the use of polite Japanese correlate with this script use? Does the use of what is stereotyped as women's speech in Japan correlate with the use of this script? So I expanded my beta to include different comics and started to code. Basically, it was a very long coding process of every single representation of every single word in the comics. So every time the word go came up, I would code it based on its script. Every time the word good morning came up, I would code it based on the script it was written in. And this produced a very, very large database that allowed me to see what words were actually appearing in which representations. And most importantly, whether the representation was normative for the comic, because sometimes the comic authors were using representations as their norm that did not match with the norms of, say, a newspaper. So the variation in that comic was actually when the comic aligned with standard writing rather than when the comic used what would be non-standard in informal speech. And this allowed for me to find, one, that a lot of variation is really difficult to explain. There was a lot of variation I found that I had no idea why it was happening and I couldn't attribute it to any context. But also I did find that a lot of variation was happening for ways that were linked to specific characters and character types in the comic. And it was never just like, this character is young, therefore this, or this character is a male, therefore this. It was always they're performing some kind of identity. And when they're young, but they fail to perform that, the variation would stop. Key example is that children would often have no kanji in their speech. But if a child was like really, really smart or pretending to be a samurai in a form of play, or sometimes the authors would have the children like talk to the reader as if the child has like planned something. One scene has the parents fighting and then the child suddenly stands up for the first time and the parents make up. And then the child looks at the reader and says, haha, like I planned this whole thing. And all of a sudden kanji appeared in the children's speech as if they were like an adult, right? If they had planned this whole thing. So this identity was being ascribed to the character. I think most interesting was that in one comic where the author's normative script use did not match the normative script use you see in a newspaper, switching to the normative script use that you would see in a newspaper was actually a way of making characters perform like a very, very formal stance. Like when they were being polite, all of a sudden the manga's norms disappeared and then the characters, would adopt that. And I found this to be quite interesting personally and sort of was my PhD thesis. But before I wrote the book, I realized that I was kind of only looking at one angle, which was the ascription of identities onto fictional characters. And I wanted to go and check out the other angle, which is if Japanese people read into the script that they see. Like when Japanese people read a text message or a letter, do they pay attention to the script that's being used? And do they assume things about the author? Do they use script when they convey messages in real life? And so I did a number of surveys, one of which was sort of a matched guise, which is something in sociolinguistics where people are presented with a use of language which is identical except for some variation. Usually it's accent, so people with different accents will read the same passage, and then different videos, audio clips will be shown to different respondents. For me, I just had short Japanese texts, and I changed the script balance and showed them randomly to people and saw how interpretation of the authors of those, varied just based on those kind of orthographic changes. And in this way, I tried to make it sure that my book not only attended to the top-down description of identity, but also if and how Japanese people read into the variation they encountered, and to show that it's not just something that occurs in media, not just something that occurs in the fictional identities, but something that people actually do consider when they read Japanese and use Japanese in their day-to-day lives.
I think for me, to add on to this, as I've said to everyone here, Wes and I have a long relationship. We've known each other for a number of years and had lots of debates. One of the things that I've found particularly important about what you've been doing, Wes, is also avoiding a prescriptivist approach. So making assumptions based on ideology, and making sure that you turn to the data and allow the data to drive the analysis, which I think for many of us is a really obvious thing that we should be doing. But both you and I, Wes, have had frustrations with colleagues writing in the Japanese language in Japan, not doing this and simply making judgments. Katakana equals foreign. Foreign people speak katakana. Oh, look, I found an example of that. Hence, I've proven my pre-assumed knowledge is correct.
Yes.
And that's something that I think both you and I have been frustrated by. So I think for me, one of the exciting things about this book is that it shows a new way of doing this sort of research that pushes back against that tendency. Sorry to editorialize, but I just really wanted to convey that point because I find it very analytically mature. So with regards to this Match Guys activity that you've done, were there any really kind of interesting or surprising results that you encountered that you did not expect to encounter and that just kind of said, oh, wow, and completely changed the way you were thinking about things?
Well, actually, jumping on the what you called an editorial there, I think links quite well because the responses were varied, which was great because it was very clear to me that there was no single interpretation. And some people had incredibly drastically different interpretations. There was no absolute, okay, I've added hiragana here, therefore this. But one thing that I did find fascinating is actually the way that hiragana was interpreted, because hiragana is in the literature often just described as, again, very functionalist, very top-down prescriptive. Hiragana is cute, hiragana is feminine. If you want to make something sound cute and feminine, use hiragana. There was responses that way. I did have one respondent who just said, I thought the author was a woman because there's a lot of hiragana. I was like, okay, well, there you go. That was very, stereotypical. But for one text, which initially was about someone who said that they were having some medical issues and they wondered if it was all psychosomatic because the doctor said they couldn't find anything. And then they mentioned consulting their parents about it and then asked people online for advice. And for all versions of this, so all the 4 versions I showed, everyone thought the idea that the author lived at home was quite common. But in the hiragana version, actually, we saw a shoot up high of the assumption the author was a man. So this quote unquote feminine script which actually was, associated with women writers in the past, was causing, and only for this version, this didn't happen for the others, the assumption that the author, was male. And the reason why is that for whatever reason, the combination of the language use, the discussion of health issues, the mention of living at home and talking to your parents in this text made people think that the author was a 30 to 40-year-old man with no education or job prospects, who was kind of a pain to deal with. And that response came up time and time again. It was not present in any of the other texts. And then all of a sudden, when I increased hiragana, these people were saying, this guy just has, he just lives at home. He has no job prospects. This sort of prospectless male identity, as I believe the term that I kind of summed up for it, appeared with the hiragana heavy variation. And there was also a quote that I found very interesting where someone engaged with the idea that hiragana was cute, but then wondered who actually uses it because of that. So one of the texts had hiragana increased and they said, I don't really know who could be using this. Is it someone that thinks hiragana is cute? Who would do that? Probably someone that's a pain to deal with. So the idea that human hiragana was cute was accepted, but the idea that anyone would actually write in hiragana because it's cute was actually linked to someone who isn't cute and is actually just, a pain. And this kind of variation was, in my opinion, very, very interesting. I did see things that matched the stereotypes, but I saw things that, again, completely deviated from them, with hiragana making the author appear masculine to be one of them.
Thank you, Wes. So another question I'd like to ask is, the book reflects a lot, as you've mentioned, on manga comics and also other forms of kind of media communication. And of course, a number of our colleagues here in MCCALL do work on media communication, popular culture, and so forth. So I'm wondering, is there any kind of insight that your book could give us, either on Japanese media and communication culture specifically, or just media and communication culture more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that media in general serves as a really, really amazing data source. And this is something which has fortunately seen a lot more recognition in my field over the last few years, about last decade or so. As while traditionally in linguistics, media was just rejected because it's not authentic, right? It's not real. But nevertheless, we see in Japanese media these beliefs about language use and language users, how people should speak, how people shouldn't speak, what types of speaking might be considered cool, what types of speaking, even questions like how does a pirate speak? These completely fictional discussions are populated and propagated through Japanese media. And this creates a place for people to accept with, align, propagate, and contest beliefs about individuals, beliefs about language use, and beliefs about language users. In the comics, I saw some things that I thought were very, very stereotypical and definitely contributed to, via the channel of script was my primary interest, but also just through language, very stereotypical beliefs about how people use or should use language in Japan. But in other cases, I saw people using language and script in ways that contested, or at the very least challenged or changed, maybe had a new take on these ideas, with the marking of non-native speakers, for instance, the exact identity that got the katakana marking, the exact non-native speaker identity, and just the way that those non-native speakers were presented, if they were hostile, if they were a complete joke, or if the manga tried to sympathize with their causes, was very, very different. In one comic, which was written in the 1980s, the characters that had the katakana in their speech were kind of clowns. They were there for comedic value. And in contrast, another one which still had the same marking, which could be considered, a bit stereotypical, a bit problematic in some ways, nevertheless placed these characters in ways where the stories were sympathizing with them. So even though the katakana itself might have been drawing on a trend of mocking these speakers and mocking their speech in a way, or presenting it for somewhat humor, the presentation allowed dialogues about these characters to enter new spaces. And so I think media is a very, very fascinating area for a lot of reasons, but especially for looking at language, because we can see these trends and we can see these changes, and we can see how individual experiences with language use and language users are manifesting in different presentations, or in sometimes, unfortunately, the continuation of representations that have been harmful or problematic in the past.
Thanks, Wes. Brilliant response. So my final question, and this is indulging myself a little bit, and then I think we might have a little bit of time to talk to the audience, is that I'm primarily a theorist of gender and sexuality in Japan. I'm also a media scholar, though I identify as a cultural anthropologist. And you've mentioned a number of times that gender was something that you encountered as an interesting kind of stance or an area to explore in your data. So I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on the way that your book can kind of respond to these debates around, gender, script, play, and whether any of your work is moving in this direction, or if it's something that you'd be interested in exploring in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. So obviously one thing I'd like to explore that would require travel would be how people are actually using script in ways to express gender and play with gender and things like that. But I did find in my book some very, very interesting ways in which script and combination with context and other language uses was used to draw upon assumptions of gender. One study I did looked at pronoun script combinations. There's a number of first person pronouns in Japanese, so a number of ways of saying I, dozens of ways of saying I. And I very briefly showed people randomly script pronoun combinations and said, where do you think you might see this? What kind of character might this be associated with? And there were times when a script would never be linked to a particular gender identity until it was combined with a certain pronoun. The combination of the pronoun atashi in katakana, for instance, was linked to individuals that were generally assumed to be queer in some way, in a way that atashi and then katakana separately didn't, at least outside of context. And then in context, again, these could create assumptions of gender or playing with gender, et cetera, that would not appear outside of that context. A particular emphasis of script in one area would link to gender in a way that it wouldn't work in other areas. And recently I've moved into seeing something that was for me quite interesting, which is a phenomenon called ojisan goko, or pretending to be an old man. And this is a something that young Japanese women have been doing, where they text each other as if they are old men trying to sexually harass each other. So it sounds weird, but they sexually harass each other via text messages for fun, as a way of play, as a way of social resistance, as a way of parody. And part of this involves, drawing on features associated with older men. There's a phrase "nanchate," which is kind of like just kidding, but it's associated with people in their like 60s, 70s, and that is everywhere in these text messages. Like, hey, why don't we go out for drinks sometime? I'll pay for it. Just kidding, haha. And that'll be part of it. But what was surprising to me is that it emphasized kanji and katakana in ways that were quote unquote non-standard. And everything I'd seen up to then just had one script, like non-native speakers, katakana. Even in my own studies, I emphasized one script at a time. This document emphasizes hiragana. But when I looked into it, what had happened is that basically old men had been observing young women texting and using text online, which involved emphasis of katakana for their own purposes. And then they tried to do it, but they did it quote unquote wrong. And then they brought in their own writing habits, which often involved the increase of the use of kanji. And then young women observed this misuse of their own texting habits and exaggerated that and brought in this way of parodying in a male identity in a way that draws on features that are stereotypically assumed to be linked to younger women. And then of course, they'll do this as exaggeration. And then when they want to switch back to being themselves, they switch back to the correct use of using katakana in a way that shows their online fluency and indeed flips some power relations and turning them into the arbiters of what is, correct language use kind of in this online space. So it's gotten to a point already that people are not only using it, they're observing it, parodying it, exaggerating it, and misusing it, and then misusing the misuse on purpose, combining these, interactions in a way that I think will be very, very interesting to unpack. I wouldn't be surprised if eventually we see a way of conveying an identity that involves marked uses of all three scripts for specific elements of the sentence in the future.
And I would also add in, thanks to having been introduced to Oji-san Goko from your good self, emojis.
Yes, and emoji as well. Yes, emoji is also involved. They use uncool emoji is part of the old man writing. So you go back to cool emoji when you're done. Even the way that they laugh, actually, when they laugh as an old person, they use a different form of LOL than they do when they're actually laughing as themselves. So yeah, lots of observations in the way people represent language through writing.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Wes. So we probably don't have all that much time for discussion from the audience, but I think we should open up questions if anyone has any burning questions for Wes. And I think, Bridget, we have 10 minutes left, perhaps. Yeah. So I see a question from Yuji.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks for the talk. And I'm one of the old MMCCS, the member, and then I'm one of the people who benefit from this merger because I'm a Japanese, and then my work in the Japanese field. So I wanted to ask about generation issue, and then which is sort of part of covered, and yeah, I'm part of Oji-san, and myself, the generation, the old people, when we use the those different the forms, say for coffee, and probably my generation, myself being old, probably use katakana. But I deliberately use the hiragana, and then that sort of to me indicates that I'm playful, irony, and then also knowing that there could be either regarded as a retarded, but that's a performativity because my the background is performance studies, so I'm very much interested in the sort of performative intention of the use of the language. And then the second point, the second is the question. I don't know whether you're interested in going to the stickers, like when I'm going to communicate with my old friend from high school, we just use all those stickers and just kind of huge kind of stickers, one after the other. And then if you look at someone from outside, we just totally retarded. but that's how we communicate as a kind of,
Mm.
back, because of, communicating with old friend from high school.
Mm.
So that we can back into the old time, and we knowing that we are playing with language.
Mm.
So maybe, you might be interested in this sort of area. And I can be the, your case study. So
No, it is very interesting. I haven't looked into stamps. There's a great book called MojiCalMoji, and that has like a bunch of studies on this area, and they've looked into the different ways in which groups are using these. I know that there's a term called staren, which is stampu renzoku, or continuation of stamps, which young people just send massive amounts of stamps to each other as a part of play. And I haven't looked into it all, but I do imagine the way that different people of different generations, which stamps they choose, for instance, could become a social marker as well. I haven't moved into that kind of exact space, but I have seen for sure the way that, what we are trying to send off, that we're playful, might not come off as playful to someone else. Oftentimes what we think is playful is not seen as that. When we see our kids doing something that they think is playful and then we try to do it, all of a sudden it's lame. And these kind of changes, happen rapidly. And I think that one thing that's very interesting to note is that as, texting, online spaces, things like Twitter have really opened the door for people not only to write more, but to pay attention to how people write more. And so while these kind of ideologies, I'm sure, were always there, when you didn't see how your friends wrote, maybe ever, like maybe you never wrote a letter to one of your friends, you might have never seen the way that they used script in their day-to-day life. You might not have paid attention to this as much, but now that we're engaging with writing and using writing to communicate daily, these sort of social divides based on which stamps you use, which emoji you use, when you use them, which hiragana, katakana, kanji you use, I think are going to get more and more vivid as we go forward.
Are there any other questions? Thank you, Yuji. That's fantastic. Billy. Hi, Billy. Billy, you're muted.
Okay. All right. I was wondering if you had covered or seen much coverage of any significant difference in range for how people represent their own selves or reflect their own group identity through different scripts versus how they might reflect the identity of other groups. And that could be, fictionally, obviously in manga, but I also think like in newspapers, how people would quote what the Prime Minister said or something like that.
So generally speaking, when people are representing someone else's language and they want to ascribe an identity onto them via script, there tends to be a lot more than anyone would use by themselves. So for instance, the use of katakana, non-native speakers of Japanese don't use katakana when they write their own dialogue. And when people do use katakana in their own speech, it's generally quite targeted. Whereas when it's used to kind of attribute an identity to someone, it's often very, very stressed in ways that, again, people might not actually write. I've seen pretentious characters or characters that are very show-offy will often have a script emphasizing kanji. Children having just complete removal of kanji, even past the time when they would actually know kanji, is something you kind of see. That said, there are overlaps. For instance, in both the comics I analyzed and the text I analyzed, script pronoun combinations were key. Script pronoun combinations were sometimes the only feature which was quote unquote non-standard and used to ascribe an identity. And people in my survey who were reviewing the text I sent them oftentimes said like that script pronoun combination to me signals this kind of person. So there are overlaps in some ways, but in other ways there are things that are definitely separate. With generally speaking, the more stereotyped the identity, the more you see a use of script that no one would ever use themselves to convey their own identity. And I think we see this is similar to representations of people's accents in comics, in that, the way people represent their own speech when it's quote unquote non-standard versus the way it's represented from above is often quite distinct. Yeah.
Bridget, how are we going for time?
We're going okay, thanks, Tom. So we would have space.
Yeah, so if there's another question, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see one from Lauren.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. So I had a question about how you're commenting how katakana doesn't necessarily have to denote that denote something being foreign, for example. Because then there's a famous girls manga author named Irina Tanimura, and she would comment frequently that she couldn't use katakana in some of her historical mangas because they didn't have those foreign loan words at the time. So what do you think some other examples of usages that katakana could have? Because in this instance, for example, it's not foreign or it's not historical, it could be used differently.
I actually have, I have some examples of that, because katakana was used with, like, there were people that wrote Japanese in katakana only, and katakana kanji combinations were actually quite common throughout Japanese history. Hiragana becoming the base script for grammatical elements is fairly new. And I've been doing some, this is going to sound like a bit of a jump, but I've been doing some research on the Japanese death metal scene. And there's a Japanese death metal band who writes all of their lyrics in kanji and katakana. And the reason is to kind of connect with and produce a sense of metalness. I had a long interview with the author, and he said that, hiragana to him is out. If he wants to produce this kind of metal identity, it needs to be this script that he views as old, and he used the word cursed. So bringing this sort of sense of katakana, not as foreign, but as traditional Japanese, right? Kanji and katakana together for him bring out this kind of samurai and also at the same time metal image that he wishes to convey. In another text, I actually saw one of the texts that I increased the amount of katakana for, someone gave a very, very specific explanation of saying that the use of katakana in this text to them reminds them of how, and this is a direct quote, pretentious women in their 40s to 60s, right? And it was, again, that was just one interpretation. It wasn't a common one, but this person said, I've seen people write like this and they all fit into this group. And so there are these, individuals are noting things that might not be nationwide in terms of very common ideology, but are definitely circulating in ways that we really, really wouldn't expect. So I'd say that the use of katakana to index kind of foreignness is perhaps the most common use, definitely the most well-recognized. But there are a lot of uses that are going on. And as people say, again, connect with a international identity, such as a metal identity, they might reimagine scripts in new ways that are both kind of local and translocal in that way.
Oh, thank you.
Might have time for one more quick question, perhaps.
So, Chris?
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks. That was really inspiring and fascinating. I'm kind of following up possibly on some of the questions on like performing identity, and I wonder a bit about the interaction with the device and the machine, and how that, play of standard, non-standard is shaped by some algorithmic, predictive text, that kind of thing. I know it from Swiss German, where we do a lot of similar things. Because there's not a written formalized grammar, we can kind of change a lot, and we can do a lot of these impersonations, and it becomes a really distinctive part of social groups that you develop your own little impersonations of each other and all this kind of stuff. And you're constantly battling with the device, right? You want to be quick, but the device is constantly autocorrecting and rewriting, and you start to build that into the actual conversation as a kind of a further joke. So I'm just interested in that mechanicity, which seems to enhance some of the performativity of the language, and if you can observe that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually fantastic. I'm glad you mentioned that, because when you write Japanese on a phone, et cetera, it does try to help you out by suggesting things, and it will suggest partially based on what the norm is nationally, and then partially based on what you've done before. So if you enter something you didn't want to enter, it'll actually start recommending it, which can be frustrating. But when I did my study with manga, one of the reasons I did code everything is I did want to make sure I didn't want to say like, look, this is non-standard, therefore it has meaning. And I did find things that did seem to be like typos. And I actually interviewed some of the comic authors, and they said, I was like, look, this is really interesting. You meant something by this, right? And they said, no, typo. But once we leave the space of comics, we do find those typos can become socially meaningful, because in groups be like, hey, that's a kind of funny typo. And then they start using it in the in-group over and over and over. This was first noted in Japanese on web forums. Some people mistyped things, and then everyone just thought, oh, that's kind of a funny way of saying thank you. And then it became kind of an index of membership in that group. And I have seen that with script as well. Again, with the pretending to be an old man thing, a lot of that's just based on the idea that, you know, the old people just pick every kanji representation that comes up. And so in parodying that, they're kind of parodying the technological incompetence. And I did see people who were analyzing the text I sent, and some of them said, the katakana use here makes me think that they're not very good at writing because they're just selecting whatever comes up on their phone. So the idea that a certain type of person just does that, just selects the script that comes up, was itself seen as like a social act. And so not thinking about what representation you used was itself even linked to kind of social identities. So yeah, absolutely. Some of these identity linked representations are just accidents that either people think are funny or people think are cool.
Yeah.
I think that's probably, we're at 4:57 by my clock. So I think we probably do need to wrap it up. Bridget, do I hand over to you to finish things up, or?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, thanks. Thanks so much, Tom. And Tom presided over this with a sore throat, so I think that's particularly heroic. But thank you for your really careful, thoughtful and engaged reading of Wes's book. Wes, am I right in thinking this is your first book?
Yes, this is my first book.
So look, congratulations on that. It's been wonderful to hear from two first-time book authors in our first two seminars. So from you, Wes, and from Ty, and I know you're presenting another paper in another time zone tonight. So thank you very much for that, Wes. And I think you and Tom have really shown through this discussion this afternoon ways in which we can approach research from different angles, and there are so many aspects of this research that relate to work on digital media, on popular culture, on gaming, on gender. I think that so we really can all learn from each other, and thank you for helping demonstrate to that to us this afternoon.